Homeless boy returns millionaire's wallet and discovers a shocking secret when he sees his mother's picture inside the wallet. Before the story, leave a comment below letting us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the video. The streets were deserted that cold winter night. The wind cut mercilessly like sharp blades that pierced through Bradley's thin and worn clothes. Snow covered the city like a white blanket, hiding the dirt and harshness of the world he knew all too well. But for 12-year-old Bradley, snow didn't bring the beauty or enchantment that many saw. For him, it was just one more obstacle, another daily challenge in his constant struggle for survival. He walked slowly through the streets, illuminated by streetlights, his feet sinking into the snow that had piled up on the sidewalks. The intense cold no longer bothered him as much as it used to, as he had grown accustomed to the elements. He was hungry, a feeling that had followed him like a shadow since he ran away from foster homes. His sharp eyes scanned his surroundings, looking for anything that might serve as food, even if it was discarded scraps in the trash. It wasn't the first time he had searched for food in dumpsters, and it wouldn't be the last. Bradley stopped in front of a metal trash can, his distorted reflection visible on its dirty surface. His warm breath formed clouds of vapor in the icy air. He looked around, making sure no one was watching, before plunging his thin hands into the trash can. The smell was unbearable, a mix of spoiled food, filth, and moisture. But his stomach growled, and there was no room for pride at that moment. After a few minutes of rummaging through the garbage, he found half a sandwich, partially frozen. It was enough for the night. As he devoured the food, his hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the desperation that gripped him. Bradley closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember a time when he didn't have to fight so hard to survive. His mind wandered to his mother, Angela, a woman he revered and loved deeply. He remembered how she had done everything she could to protect him from the cruel world, even while battling her own illness. Her always serene face gave him strength. He stopped eating and reached into the inner pocket of his dirty, torn coat, pulling out the only valuable object he still owned, a picture of his mother. Angela, with her black hair and sweet smile, was eternally frozen in that piece of paper. It was a photo taken during better days, when she still had the strength to fight and care for him, even on her own. Bradley looked at it for a few seconds, feeling a warmth in his chest that contrasted with the cold around him. "I won't let you down," he murmured, his voice hoarse, almost as if he were promising her something he wasn't sure he could fulfill. Angela had died when he was 8 years old, defeated by cancer after years of suffering and struggle. She had been everything to Bradley, the only person he could call family. When she passed, his life fell apart completely. Thrown into the foster care system, he experienced the cruelest side of society. The foster homes he passed through were worse than living on the streets. Abuse and neglect were constant, and the pain of being constantly rejected was unbearable. Until one day, tired of being treated like a burden, he ran away. Now, the streets were his home. Bradley had learned to fend for himself, to survive alone, blending in with other youths who, like him, had been forgotten by the world. However, loneliness followed him even among others. He didn't care about the temporary company of strangers who shared the sidewalks and alleys with him. The only person who really mattered was no longer there, and he knew that every day his mother's legacy was what kept him going. The wind picked up, lifting the snow around his feet. He tucked the photo back into his pocket, protecting it like the treasure it was. In that cold city, Bradley was alone, but he wouldn't let the streets destroy him. There was a strength inside him, the same strength his mother had, a resilience that kept him moving. Every day was a battle, but he was still there, fighting. With his stomach now a little less empty, he continued on, looking for shelter for the night. The city's lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to Bradley's suffering and others like him. He knew winter was far from over, but something inside him, a stubborn spark of hope, told him this wouldn't be his life forever. As he walked through the accumulated snow, something drove him forward, a silent promise, a living memory, to honor what his mother had meant to him. Even if the streets tried to smother this flame, Bradley knew that somehow he would continue, because giving up was not an option. It was just another day, another battle for survival. He passed by hurried, well-dressed rich people, all apathetic to his presence as if he were invisible. Bradley moved like a shadow among them, his eyes sharp and his instincts honed, always looking for something that might help him keep going. Then he saw him. A well-dressed man in front of a large office building, clearly distracted as he talked on the phone. When the man turned to enter the building, his wallet silently slipped from his pocket onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Bradley watched the scene for a few seconds, his heart racing. The instinct to grab the wallet and run was almost irresistible. He knew how much that money could mean to him. Food, maybe even new clothes. It was a rare opportunity. But once again, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Bradley, always do what's right. What's yours will come to you. Don't bend to what's easy. Angela's words were as vivid in his memory as the day he heard them for the last time. With a heavy sigh, he bent down, picked up the wallet and looked toward the building. The man was already about to enter. Bradley knew he had to return it. Without hesitation, he ran toward the building's lobby. When he entered, he immediately felt the warm contrast of the interior compared to the biting cold outside. People passed by him, and the place's luxury was oppressive, making him feel small and out of place. Bradley looked around and saw the man standing at the counter talking to a receptionist. He took a deep breath and approached. "Sir!" Bradley called, his voice somewhat hoarse from the cold. The man turned, surprised, and his eyes quickly fell on the wallet that Bradley was holding. "You dropped this outside," Bradley said, extending the wallet toward him. The man stood open-mouthed for a moment, clearly not believing what he was seeing. He took the wallet, still stunned, and opened it, checking that everything was in place. His gaze returned to Bradley, and a mix of gratitude and surprise crossed his face. I didn't even realize I dropped it," the man said, still in shock. "Thank you so much, kid. You saved me from a big problem." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, offering it to Bradley. "Here, as a thank you." Bradley hesitated, but gratefully took the money. He turned to leave, but something on the floor caught his attention. Near the man's feet, a fallen photo drew his eye. He bent down to pick it up, and when he held it in his hands, the shock hit him like a punch in the stomach. It was his mother, Angela, young, with the same warm smile he remembered so well. She was standing next to a man he didn't recognize, a man who looked very much like the one in front of him. Bradley's heart raced, and his breath grew heavy. A knot formed in his throat, and without thinking, he held the photo out to the man. "Why do you have this picture?" Bradley asked, his voice trembling but determined. The man looked at the photo in Bradley's hands, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He furrowed his brow, trying to process what he was seeing. His expression, once calm and polite, changed to something more serious and disturbed. How did you get this?" the man asked, his voice now lower, laden with confusion. Bradley took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the picture he always carried with him. The same image of his mother, Angela, only more worn and aged. He held it up, revealing it to the man, who now looked stunned. "That's my mother," Bradley said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Angela Miller." The man's face lost all color. He stood paralyzed for a few seconds, staring at the photo, then at Bradley, then back at the photo. The connection between the images was clear, and the reality of the situation hit him like an avalanche. "Angela!" the man murmured, almost in disbelief. This can't be... How could you be her son? Bradley swallowed hard, trying to control the wave of emotions threatening to overflow. She died a few years ago, he said, his voice breaking. She was all I had. I don't know who you are, but I want to know why you have a photo of her with you. The man took a deep breath, his eyes now filled with an emotion Bradley couldn't fully identify, a mixture of regret, pain, and surprise. I knew Angela many years ago, he said slowly, as if each word was difficult to say. We fell in love, but... He paused, running a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. I was young and foolish. My family didn't approve of our relationship. They didn't think she was suitable for me, and I left her. The silence that followed was cutting. Bradley felt anger rising inside him as the story began to unfold before him. I never knew she was pregnant, the man continued, his voice heavier now. Years later I tried to find her, but it was too late. I found out she had died, and since then I've been looking for you. I am your father, Bradley. The man's words hung in the air, dense and hard to believe. Bradley felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about the suffering he and his mother had endured, was now turned upside down. The man standing in front of him, Anthony Robinson, wasn't just anyone. He was his father, the man who had abandoned his mother when she needed him most. Bradley felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of him wanted to scream, to accuse him, to hold him responsible for all the years of pain and suffering. But another part of him was shocked and lost. He had never imagined finding his father like this. And now, everything he had lived through seemed like just a prelude to that moment. I know I can't change the past, Anthony said, his voice heavy with regret. But if you give me a chance, I want to make things right. I want you to have the life you deserve, away from the streets. Please come with me. Bradley looked into the eyes of the man who claimed to be his father, and all he felt was a whirlwind of hurt, anger, and a deep pain he didn't know how to handle. It was a difficult decision, to believe this man and accept his offer, or hold on to the hard life he knew, fueled by the pain of irreparable abandonment. The silence between Bradley and Anthony in the lobby of the building was heavy. The words, "I am your father," still echoed in Bradley's mind, mingling with the biting cold of the night he had just left behind. Anthony looked at the boy, trying to absorb the reality that his son, whom he had never known existed, was standing right in front of him. But there was something more, a birthmark on the back of Bradley's hand, identical to the one Anthony had. It was as if destiny had placed that mark to leave no doubts. Bradley. I can't leave you out on the streets, Anthony said, his voice low but firm. Not now, not after all of this. Bradley looked at him with suspicion. Part of him wanted to refuse, to run back to what he knew, even if it meant continuing to face the cold, hunger, and loneliness. But there was something in the way Anthony spoke, not just the regret in his eyes, but also a sense of obligation. After all, he was his father. Reluctantly, Bradley accepted the invitation to go to Anthony's apartment. He didn't know what to expect. He had never been in a luxurious place, much less the apartment of a wealthy man like Anthony. But as he huddled in the leather seat of the car that was taking him to this new reality, the cold of the streets seemed more distant and the emptiness of his life more present than ever. When they arrived at the building, Bradley hesitated to get out of the car. The structure was imposing, with a modern facade and windows gleaming like jewels in the night. He knew he was about to step into a world completely different from what he was used to, and it unsettled him. Entering that place meant, in a way, abandoning the streets, but also the memory of his mother, Angela, who had fought with everything she had to care for him without help, without luxuries. Bradley felt torn. The guilt weighed on his chest, as if being there was a betrayal to his mother. Anthony noticed the boy's hesitation and, without saying a word, placed his hand on Bradley's shoulder in a silent gesture of support. Slowly, Bradley entered the building and was taken to Anthony's luxurious apartment. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the contrast between his previous life and this new reality was overwhelming. The elegant furniture, the large windows overlooking the illuminated city, the soft carpets, everything seemed to come from a world that wasn't his. He felt small, lost. Every detail of that apartment reminded him of where he came from and how his mother had never had the chance to offer him something like this. Anthony led him to the room he had prepared for him, a spacious area with a comfortable bed and new clothes waiting for him. Bradley stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to lie in that bed, didn't want to wear those clothes. It was as if each object there screamed that he didn't belong. "I'll leave you to settle in. I know this must be strange for you," Anthony said, trying to sound understanding. "But I want you to know that you're safe here. I'll give you time to get used to it." With a silent nod, Bradley closed the door and collapsed onto the floor beside the bed. He couldn't bring himself to lie on that soft mattress, when for so long all he had were pieces of cardboard and old blankets. The memory of his mother came rushing back, and he remembered the difficult days after her death. The foster homes where he had been sent were places of pain and abuse, where no one really cared about him. He had run away because he couldn't bear the neglect, the loneliness, the constant broken promises. He looked at the photo of Angela that he still kept in his coat pocket, and the tears began to fall, silently. He didn't know how to feel about Anthony. The man who was now trying to care for him was the same one who had abandoned his mother, who had left her to face the world alone. How could he accept that? How could he see Anthony as a father when he had let Angela suffer so much? While these questions swirled in his mind, Anthony, on the other side of the door, was also in conflict. Sitting in the living room, he looked at his hands and remembered how young and irresponsible he had been when he met Angela. He had made the biggest mistake of his life by abandoning her, by giving in to his family's pressure. Now, faced with Bradley, he felt the weight of all his wrong choices. He had lost years with his son, years he could never get back. But in that moment, he was determined to do whatever he could to fix what was still fixable. Days passed, and the tension between the two remained. Bradley refused to feel at home in that place, still sleeping on the floor beside the bed. He barely spoke to Anthony, avoiding any attempt at closeness. With every silent meal, every cold interaction, Anthony saw the emotional chasm between them growing wider. He tried, but Bradley's emotional barriers seemed impenetrable. One night, sitting at the dinner table, Anthony tried to break the silence. "I know you don't trust me, and I understand," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I let you down, and I let your mother down. I know I can't fix the past, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn the chance to be your father." Bradley, his eyes downcast, didn't respond immediately. There was anger inside him, but there was also a nearly silent desire to believe Anthony's words, to believe that maybe he was telling the truth. "She never talked about you," Bradley said, his voice low and bitter. "Not once. Because you were gone." The words hit Anthony like a blow. He knew it was true. He knew he had hurt Angela deeply. And now he was reaping the consequences of that, seeing his son look at him as if he were a stranger, perhaps even an enemy. "I never stopped thinking about her," Anthony confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "I never forgot her. But I was a coward. I chose the easy way out, and it was the worst mistake of my life." Bradley remained silent, his emotions a storm inside him. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But for the first time since stepping into that apartment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, Anthony was being sincere. That night passed, but the words lingered. Bradley still didn't know if he could trust Anthony, if he could see him as a father, but something inside him began to shift. Even though he remained distant, something new was starting to grow, a seed of doubt, perhaps even hope, that one day he might find a place where he truly belonged, even between two worlds so different. The days dragged on in Anthony's luxurious apartment, but the tension between father and son seemed to grow like a storm about to explode. Bradley, only 12 but carrying emotional baggage that made him seem much older, spent most of his time isolated, avoiding Anthony's presence whenever possible. He refused to sleep in the comfortable bed and continued sleeping on the floor, a symbolic resistance to the luxury that bothered him so much. He knew that sooner or later he would have to confront Anthony, and the sense of injustice and pain he carried was about to erupt. That night, the confrontation they had both been avoiding finally happened. It was late, and the silence in the apartment seemed heavier than ever. Bradley was in the living room, his mind restless, while Anthony watched from a distance. Weeks of frustrated attempts at closeness, avoided glances, and empty conversations had reached their limit. "Do you think you can just show up and fix everything?" Bradley suddenly blurted, his voice breaking the silence. He stood up from where he had been sitting, his eyes burning with anger. "Do you think that just because you have money and can take me off the streets, it erases everything my mother and I went through?" Anthony, standing on the other side of the room, turned to face his son. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for the intensity of Bradley's words. His voice was thick with the pain he had been holding back. "I know I can't erase what happened," Anthony began, his voice low, "but I'm trying to do what I can now. I'm trying to do the right thing." "Trying now," Bradley interrupted, stepping forward, his eyes burning with frustration. "Now? After all these years? Where were you when my mother was dying? Where were you when she was fighting alone to take care of me?" His voice grew louder as he spoke, and the words poured out in torrents of anger. "You left her. You left both of us and never looked back." Each word hit Anthony like a dagger. He had no excuses, and he knew it. The guilt had eaten him up inside for years, and now, seeing Bradley standing there, full of pain and resentment, he finally understood the depth of the damage he had caused. "You don't know what we went through," Bradley continued, tears starting to stream down his face. "She never said a word about you. Not once. You don't exist to me. Not after everything we lived through. How can you say you loved her when you left her alone?" Anthony bowed his head, his hands trembling slightly. He knew Bradley's pain was justified, and he felt every word like a reflection of the hurt he had inflicted on Angela as well. He had been a coward, and that haunted him every day. "I made terrible mistakes," Anthony responded, his voice breaking with regret. "I know nothing I say can undo what happened, but I never stopped loving Angela. Never." He looked at Bradley, his eyes full of guilt and sorrow. "I was weak. I let my family control me, pull me away from her, and I hate myself for that. But what you need to know is that I never stopped thinking about her." Bradley looked at him, confused, still filled with anger, but now a small seed of doubt began to grow in his heart. "You talk like that matters now," Bradley said, still skeptical. "Words don't change what we lived through." "I know," Anthony admitted, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He walked over to a nearby cabinet and pulled out a bundle of old, yellowed letters. "But maybe this can show you that I'm not just saying words. I wrote letters to her all these years, but I never had the courage to send them. I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of what I'd done, and that's why she never knew how much I regretted it." He handed the bundle of letters to Bradley, who looked at the yellowed papers with skepticism. There was something deeply sad about the gesture, something that made Bradley pause for a moment and look at his father with a new perspective. The letters were there, written by a man who had clearly struggled with his own guilt and regret. Anthony, for all his flaws, seemed to be genuinely trying. Bradley took the letters with trembling hands, unsure of what to think. Part of his anger began to dissolve, but the hurt remained, deep and painful. Still, seeing those letters that could have changed the course of his mother's life and his own if they had been sent, made him realize something he had been ignoring. Anthony was hurting too. "Did you really love her?" Bradley asked, his voice quieter, full of doubt. "More than anything," Anthony replied sincerely, "and I lost her because of my weakness. I know I can't fix that, but I want to help you now, Bradley. I want to try to be the father you never had, if you'll let me." There was a long silence between them. Bradley looked at the letters in his hands, trying to absorb it all. The anger he had carried for so long wouldn't disappear overnight, but for the first time, he felt that maybe his father was truly trying to mend the damage. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Bradley said, his voice hesitant but honest. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Anthony nodded, understanding. "I don't expect you to forgive me right now," he said. "I just want you to know that I'm here, and if you need me, I'll be by your side." Bradley looked down at the floor, still confused by what he felt, but at the same time he realized that there was an opening, a chance to try to understand the man standing in front of him better. Maybe I can get to know you better," Bradley said with hesitation. Anthony smiled slightly, realizing that this small step meant much more than words. He wanted Bradley to heal, to find his place in the world, but he knew the road ahead would be long. "I was thinking," Anthony said after a moment of silence, "maybe we could do something together, something that might help you understand that I really want to change." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's a shelter here in the city for homeless people. I used to donate money, but this time I thought we could go there together, do some volunteer work. Maybe it will help you reconnect with the world you came from and help me better understand what you went through." Bradley thought for a moment. The idea of going back to a shelter made him uncomfortable, but at the same time, he felt that it might be a step toward healing for both him and Anthony. "Maybe," he murmured, still uncertain but willing to try. And with that small step, the gap between father and son began to close, even if only a little. The cold morning air wrapped around the city as Bradley walked alongside Anthony toward the homeless shelter. His hands buried in his coat pockets, he still wasn't sure what to expect from the experience. Reluctant at first, Bradley had finally agreed to go, even with the uncertainties still lingering in his heart. Anthony, walking beside him, was silent, aware that this was a delicate step in building their relationship. When they arrived at the shelter, the familiar smell and the sound of mixed voices hit Bradley hard. He recognized that environment. It was the same kind of place where he had taken refuge on some of the more difficult nights on the streets, seeking shelter from the cold and hunger. The difference now was that he was there to help, not as someone desperate, but as someone beginning to find a way to redefine his own pain. The following days at the shelter were transformative. At first, Bradley kept a certain distance from the people there. He saw in their faces the reflection of his own experience, the marks of the daily struggle for survival, the void left by the lack of hope. However, as time passed, and he began talking to some of the shelter's residents, a genuine connection started to form. Bradley recognized the stories, felt the pain of others as his own, and this led him to realize something important. His experience on the streets didn't define him as a victim, but as someone who could use what he had lived through to help others. Anthony watched with growing admiration as his son opened up to this new reality. Seeing him interact with the people at the shelter, Anthony began to truly understand what Bradley had faced during all those years on the streets. The stories he heard, the experiences Bradley shared, allowed Anthony to slowly glimpse a part of his son's life that he could never have imagined. The time they spent together at the shelter also began to strengthen their relationship. The silences that had once been filled with tension were now more comfortable. The once brief and fragmented conversations now flowed more naturally. Anthony, who had initially been anxious to prove his regret, now focused on just being present, allowing the bond with Bradley to grow slowly, without rushing. A few weeks later, during a quiet dinner at Anthony's apartment, a meaningful conversation between father and son changed the course of their lives in a profound way. "I was thinking," Bradley began, his eyes downcast as he played with his food, "that maybe we could do something in memory of my mother." Anthony stopped what he was doing and looked at his son, curious. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice full of attention. Bradley hesitated for a moment, still thinking about the words he wanted to use. He had spent days reflecting on how to turn his pain into something positive, something that could honor Angela's memory, but also help others. "She always told me that studying was important, that if she could, she would have continued her studies to give me a better life," Bradley explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I know there are a lot of people out there like her who don't have the chance to keep studying because they have to take care of their kids alone. So, I thought maybe we could create a scholarship in her name to help single parents keep studying." Anthony felt a lump in his throat as he listened to Bradley's words. The proposal was a reflection not only of his son's intelligence and sensitivity, but also of his desire to turn his story of pain into something that could benefit others. It was a clear symbol of the emotional healing process that Bradley was beginning to undertake. "That's an amazing idea, Bradley," Anthony said with a sincere smile. "I think your mother would be very proud of you. Let's make it happen." The two spent the following weeks planning the details of the scholarship, and Bradley began to get more actively involved in the process. For him, it was a way to honor Angela's struggle, to ensure that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. At the same time, he also took important steps in his own life, deciding to go back to school with the help of tutors Anthony had hired. Even with the new reality of life he was beginning to accept, Bradley made it clear that he didn't want to forget his roots. "I'll never stop being who I am," he said one day while talking to Anthony. "I don't want to erase what I lived through on the streets. It's part of me, and I want to remember it so I can help others going through the same thing." Anthony deeply respected that decision. He knew that the pain Bradley had endured had shaped him, but he also knew that his son was now beginning to find a new purpose, something that transcended the anger and resentment. As the months went by, father and son continued to build a relationship based on respect and understanding. The wounds of the past didn't disappear, but little by little they were being healed by the mutual effort to overcome them. Anthony also began volunteering regularly at the shelter, not just to support Bradley, but to learn about a world he had never known. Every conversation, every story he heard was a reminder of how much he still had to understand about the suffering he had, in a way, ignored for so long. Finally, the official launch of the scholarship in Angela's honor took place. It was a simple event, but full of meaning. Bradley gave a speech, talking about his mother's impact on his life, her strength as a single mother, and the importance of giving opportunities to other parents who, like Angela, struggled to care for their children while dreaming of a better future. At the end of the event, as father and son watched people leave, Bradley felt that for the first time in a long time, something was different inside him. A feeling that was no longer anger or pain, but a new hope that despite all the challenges, he and Anthony were forging a new path together. This was just the beginning of their journey, but they both knew that together they could face any obstacle that might come. More than the blood that united them, it was the conscious effort to overcome the hurts of the past and build a future of healing and transformation that made their relationship stronger. And so, with the memories of Angela always present, Bradley and Anthony moved forward. No longer as strangers trying to reconcile, but as a family that was slowly learning to blossom again. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.